China has more than 200 confirmed cases of coronavirus, it's called, which produces pneumonia-like symptoms. 3 people have already died from this illness,
in which he
which has
worked.
spread to at least.
But if action had been taken when he and others started sounding alarms, the severity of the outbreak might have been understood
sooner. The Chinese
sooner.
government scrambles to contain the virus. The U.S. Embassy in Beijing confirms the first American death, a 60-year-old who died
Breaking
in
news.
Wuhan.
The first death from coronavirus here in the United States. A man in his 50s dying from COVID-19 infection in Washington state.
We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
COVID-19, one of the deadliest and most prominent pandemics since the 1918 Spanish flu. The outbreak of COVID took the whole world by surprise, from the first case in Wuhan, China in December of 2019 to the establishment of a worldwide pandemic in early March of 2020. The whole world went on lockdown, and everyone's lives were flipped upside down in all of their own ways. Some workplaces were able to evolve and offer online positions, but some other industries, like food service, suffered tremendously. The state of today's economy is also still recovering from the effects of the pandemic. It's safe to say that the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic continue to have an impact in people's day-to-day lives today. In this podcast, we're going to cover what exactly the pathogen that's responsible for COVID-19 is and how it works. So let's jump right into it from the very beginning of the virus's life.
Okay, for a quick intro to COVID-19, COVID belongs to the beta coronavirus genus, as well as the Coronaviridae family. There are currently 7 types of coronavirus. 4 of them are pretty similar to common colds, while the other 3 are more severe and sometimes fatal in certain cases. The 3 types of more severe coronavirus are SARS-CoV-1, SARS-CoV-2, which is the COVID-19 we're talking about, and MERS-CoV. COVID-19 is referred to as a respiratory disease that is spread through contact with infected droplets and aerosols. So these aerosols can linger in the air for hours at the upper limit, and aerosols are generally spread by coughing or even speaking. The upper limit for how far these aerosols can usually travel is around 6 feet, which is where they got the whole 6 feet number when they were talking about social distancing. So generally the life cycle of COVID-19 starts with the binding and viral entry via membrane fusion or endocytosis into your cells and the release of that viral genome into those cells. With the release of that viral genome, there's transmission of the viral polymerase protein, which leads to RNA replication and genomic transcription. It's the hijacking of your cells to produce more virus, really. Eventually, the viral genome is translated into viral structural proteins. The S, E, and M proteins are combined with nucleocapsid, and the formation of mature virion happens in your cells. Finally, once all these mature virions are created, it's released into your body through exocytosis to infect more of your cells.
So the first parts of the actual virus weren't known to be COVID-19 for a little while. So it wasn't until December 31st of 2019 that China reported a cluster of cases of pneumonia in Wuhan. So it wasn't actually determined to be coronavirus for a little while after that. The World Health Organization reported that there was a cluster of these cases. There was no deaths in early January. And it wasn't until January 12th that China publicly shared the genetic sequence of the COVID-19 virus. On January 13th, the day after that, officials confirmed a case of COVID-19 in Thailand, which was the first recorded case outside of China. Still in January, there was a lot of misconceptions and unknowing of what exactly this virus was and how it could transmit. On January 22nd, the World Health Organization issued a statement saying that there was evidence of human-to-human transmission in Wuhan, but there needed to be more investigation to understand the full extent of it. In February, it was more about actions taken to prevent the spread of the virus. So, in February 3rd, the World Health Organization released a strategic plan called the Strategic Preparedness and Response Plan in order to help protect states with weaker health systems combat the spreading of the virus in their countries. However, despite their efforts, um, the virus continued to spread at alarming levels. So, on March 11th of 2020, the World Health Organization made the assessment that COVID-19 was characterized as a pandemic. Over the next year, countries scrambled to try to reduce the transmission, and people were researching vaccines. And it wasn't until almost an entire year after the first reported cluster of cases that a vaccine was developed. Vaccinations in the US began on December 11th in 2020, and they were first given to those of high risk people, like elderly, the one with autoimmune diseases, and frontline workers. After that point, vaccines were required for lots of healthcare workers, other jobs, being able to go to events, and everything like that. More strains started to develop, and the vaccine became a more normalized thing, and the development of booster shots also occurred. After about 3.5 years, the World Health Organization declared that COVID 19 was finally ended on May 11th in 2023. The pandemic was finally over.
So that's the timeline. But here, after the COVID pandemic, we are at a position to look at the real world impact of the pandemic as a whole. As of February 25th, 2024, there have been 700 million cumulative cases and 7 million cumulative deaths from COVID 19. That's a case fatality rate of 405 per 100,000 cases. The total cost of the pandemic is estimated at more than 16 trillion, or roughly 90% of the annual GDP of the United States. And those are a lot of numbers to throw at you, but personally, I think it's really easy to see the world impact of COVID 19 because it's affected people we know. I remember over the pandemic watching interviews of ER docs talking about their experience trying to treat a disease that the WHO has no known treatments for. It's scary, it's new, and it's crazy that you can find thousands of these accounts and they're all saying the same thing.
Yeah, I had a personal experience. My dad ended up working with a patient early on before any vaccine was actually given out. And the only thing flying around was that things like hydrochloroquine was a cure, naturopathic remedies like vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc were recommended to take to prevent the disease. And these were all things that there wasn't enough research, there wasn't enough time to see if this was really a preventative cause. So my dad ended up going in, working with patients, um, and putting himself at risk when he really like had no other choice. I mean, he couldn't prevent anything. He couldn't, you know, there was just no knowledge of what was going on in the early
Yeah.
days.
And I remember in the story hearing about like the most demoralizing thing is to go into work every day and then find out now you're treating one of your coworkers,
Yeah.
which
Oh my
is a
gosh.
crazy experience of thinking of like that could be you
Mhm.
and you still don't really have anything you can do. And it's like the idea of if you had more time, you would have known what to do. And retrospectively, it's hard to look back with the modern treatment options we do
Yeah.
have now. And that's great, but not every single person in the world works in a hospital. So, but despite that, we can see the COVID pandemic affecting really any job.
Mhm.
Were you looking for jobs over the pandemic?
Yeah, I was actually working. I mean, I applied for my first job during the pandemic. So I was working at Red Lobster in the service industry. So in the beginning of my job, there were so many, um, I don't know, kind of management issues, and they're trying to work around it. And I remember I got hired, and then I couldn't work for 2 weeks because there was a a lockdown in my hometown. So a lot of my working experience was learning how to work around the pandemic. My first ever job experience was working around the pandemic. So I would have to sanitize everything and wipe all the surfaces just because I would be putting people at risk if I didn't do that. So that was actually a really big thing. And not a lot of people have ever said, oh, but I worked my first job in a pandemic. You know, people would like work in an ice cream shop and scoop stuff. And I mean, there's stuff like that you don't really think about that can really affect how you see life.
Yeah, and you're hearing a lot of people. I have friends that like the first job they ever worked was remote. And that's like a crazy idea if you ever talk to like your parents or anything. But I think it's interesting, and I honestly don't know what the impacts of like there are a lot of jobs now that are going just virtual because it's just easier.
Yeah.
And that's like 100% a pandemic thing.
Yeah, I know. I actually noticed that too. So after, everyone was forced to kind of work from home or go to school from home, it made it a lot easier to see like what positions were actually able to be done from home. You didn't have to go into an office to log in onto some website and, you know, I don't really know exactly what types of jobs those are, but I'm assuming it's something where you're working kind of more with computers and stuff like that, and that can easily be done from your home, from the comfort of your own home, and you don't have to make the commute and go all the way. And I mean, we were forced to have to live and deal with that to adapt. So yeah.
So, like shifting to the whole research thing and the stumbling in the dark that you feel, especially in the start of the pandemic, I feel like a lot of jobs were really doing that where they just find like one thing. It's like, oh, we're going virtual now because Bob told me to. And it's like I know it sounds crazy, but I've seriously heard cases of people doing that. And it's really interesting because research is a field where it's always slow and steady, and in a circumstance where you need like fast results, you really are running in the dark and hoping that the research catches up to you.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of treatments that they prescribed during the pandemic that turns out like doesn't really work.
Yeah,
But
not at
at the
all.
time, like what are you supposed to do?
Yeah.
You've got your one clinical trial showing maybe good. You might as well try
You
it.
have to advertise it for all the people and hope that it works.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of going more along about having to provide results. I mean, there's people that are dying. There's people that are getting infected at a massive rate. So, I mean, you kind of have to provide some sort of answers. So during the research, I mean, it's a global pandemic. It's a high priority to study and understand what's exactly going on. So kind of going along some of the statistics of the research. So, as of February 29th, 2024, there's been $4.7 trillion spent on COVID responses. Um, in 2021, there was the highest number of citations for SARS-CoV-2 in PubMed, and there was around 90,050 citations for the entire year. When COVID was searched, when people were trying to find out information on how to combat the disease, there were about 8,787,000 nucleotide results for SARS-CoV-2 on NIH. All right, so kind of bringing it back to the more personal level, what was your first interaction with COVID?
For me, COVID started as like this big scary news thing to start. I didn't have like a personal experience with COVID until like months into the pandemic at that point, and that's when my relatives started getting sick.
Yeah.
But I'd say like it was strange, a little scary, but also boring. It like being stuck inside.
Yeah, that's true. Me personally, I mean, I kind of like joked about it in the first instances of it. I don't know if you were on TikTok on the first initial kind of happenings of COVID, but I know that there was like a joke about it, like coronavirus, and people would be laughing that it was called coronavirus. So I don't know. My first like kind of bigger interaction was it what with it was I was actually traveling. So I was out in Colorado competing for a ski race, and that was like the week before my whole school shut down and the whole like lockdown started in my hometown. So I was traveling and I was going to the airport, and I remember I had to wear my ski mask to the airport because my mom was like, "You don't want to get it." And I don't know. I think I was like researching like how many cases were in the U.S. and me and my friends were joking around like, "Oh my God, what if we get it?" You know, and then just for it to kind of erupt out of the blue and become this huge thing that I don't know, kind of changed the course of history. So.
Yeah, and now it's not. Oh my God, am I gonna get it? It's like I already had it.
Yeah.
Like at this point, it's such a weird thing that it's just kind of normalized.
Yeah, I think like just for like the shift of everything and all the chaos, and now kind of looking back on it, it seemed like so long ago, but in the moment it was like the most confusing thing to navigate because everyone's saying different things and trying to come up with the right plan, and just loads and loads of misinformation just from the media. And I don't know, it's such a confusing time to navigate. Yeah. So, just kind of wrapping this up, what was your biggest takeaway?
I think, I think, at the end of the day, the biggest takeaway we can have with this pandemic, I feel like it's a lot of people's first brush with misinformation and a lot of people's first brush with like public health as a sector in general.
Hmm.
I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from, especially in those fields. And I think it's best to look back on it and just learn from our mistakes. There's really not what else we can do.
Yeah. I mean, there really wasn't a best case scenario throughout the entire time. I mean, there's not a lot that you can do. I mean, when when there's like a pandemic erupting, what can you do? But like stop people, you have to stop your lives and everything. It's like, especially in today's day and age, it's almost impossible. So yeah, I think there was a lot to learn, but also um, maybe a lot of it was exactly panned out how the best that we could do with the knowledge we had.